My name is Rory Gerberg, and I work with the firm ReadySet, where we integrate behavioral science to make organizations more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. That's everything from improving hiring and performance evaluation systems to training on inclusive culture and management. And I also specialize in sexual harassment. And I want to use that today as just a specific example of the way that we integrate behavioral science into our work. First, I want to start with a quick poll of the audience. Raise your hand if any of these apply to you. Raise your hand if you've heard of this thing called metoo. Think there's a hashtag or something? Okay, great. A few people. Raise your hand if you've had conversations with any of your colleagues one-on-one about metoo, just you and that colleague. Raise your hand if you've had any of those one-on-one conversations with a colleague from a different gender or gender identity. And raise your hand if any of those conversations have been in groups of multiple people at a time. The numbers are dwindling. Why aren't we having more of these conversations? Workplace sexual harassment is in the headlines. Why is it so difficult to have these conversations with our colleagues? I want to suggest that the answer is fear. Diversity and inclusion is uncomfortable. And while we can avoid these conversations when they're optional or self-initiated, when we walk into the training room, that fear is going to be there. And it's going to be front and center. There are multiple sources of threat in the training room. Identity threat, stereotype threat, white fragility, fear of learning something new, the list goes on. We don't have time to go into specific sources of threat. What's important is that the mechanism of threat gets in the way of learning. Why? Diversity and inclusion training require us to take in information that is challenging and goes against our existing beliefs, so we can integrate new knowledge and skill sets. But you can't do that when you're under threat. Instead, when you're in your fear or state of threat, your amygdala or your body's smoke detector is going off saying alert, 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 communicating to the rest of your body that you need to mobilize with all of your adrenaline and cortisol, as if mobilizing to that saber-toothed tiger centuries ago, except we're in the training room. What that's doing with that physiological response is taking away from your resources for executive functioning, which we know are limited, resulting in reduced attention and working memory, as well as disengagement from learning and an inflexible mindset. Well, that's a problem if we're training. That fight or flight response, not really helping anyone, at least not for learning. What does this look like in the training room? So imagine with me that you are in a sexual harassment training in your organization. And you run in, sit down, you see 20 pairs of eyes looking around hesitantly. A couple of folks that you know, who you obviously tried to sit near. A couple of folks whose names you're kind of familiar with. That guy who makes some comments or jokes that you don't really find so funny. You're not really sure what to expect. So are you excited to get started? Not so much. Everyone will come into the training room with a lived experience that will be elicited by the content covered. Everyone will come into the training room fearing that that lived experience will be invalidated by their peers. And everyone will come into that training room fearing of what they say and the implications it will have for tomorrow and next week in that team meeting. Everything that led you to avoid some of those conversations with your colleagues, sitting there front and center. So what do? We can manage that threat proactively through training design and facilitation by creating an environment of productive discomfort. More specifically, we can do these three things. We can validate threat, reappraise anxiety, and narrow attention. What does that look like? I want to show you. come with me back into that training room with those 20 pairs of eyes, except you're in my training room, so it's going to be a little different. Welcome. My training comes out of my work at Harvard on campus sexual assault and harassment, working on policies and training. And while I was there, I was in a room of 120 people in a class where there was an allegation that a male student had sexually harassed a female student. The male student was speaking up very strongly, defending himself, while the female student was holding herself back. I, at the time, was an advocate Harvard-wide, so I spoke up very strongly, saying what we know, which is that 1 in 4 women in undergraduate are sexually assaulted, and so we can imagine what that means for women in the room and their lived experiences, even if we're only hearing from the man's side of the story. As you might imagine, there was a little bit of tension in the room. People were sitting on the edges of their seats. Afterwards, a very close male friend and confidant of mine came to me and said, you know, Rory, I really want to hear what you're saying, but when you speak like that, I can't hear you. When you speak like that about men, it sounds like you're talking about all men, and I'm not one of those guys. As I later learned, he had learned his masculinity by going to strip clubs with his father. So, of course, he couldn't hear me. And in fact, I couldn't hear him either because of my own lived experience. That really led me to step back and look at the research on masculinity and really learn a deep appreciation for the complex systems that bring us into the problem that we have today. And the way I've really come to see it is that we grew up in a country without sex education, teaching us how to navigate healthy sexual boundaries. That is filled in with the lessons of pop culture and violent pornography. And then we graduate and go to college where there's a campus sexual assault epidemic. And then we graduate and go into the workplace where, surprise, surprise, we have workplace sexual harassment. So I don't see this as surprising. I see it as a logical result of the systems that have brought us here today. And while we can't change that complex trajectory of our lived experience, we can start with where we are now. If you learn something in this room, something that makes you think, I would have done something differently, I would have responded differently, that's okay, that means I'm doing my job. The goal is to learn to do it better tomorrow. Whew. Imagine those 20 eyes and that guy that makes those not so funny jokes. How does that feel? Does it feel a little different? What I'm doing is these 3 things. I'm first validating threat. By saying the statistic of 1 in 4 women, I'm validating the women in the room who have been harassed, which is terrible. By speaking of my real male colleague and his experience, I'm also validating the men in the room who are moderately terrified of being accused of being that guy. I'm then reappraising anxiety. By offering a narrative that is both structural and personal, I'm allowing participants to place that anxiety next to some compassion about this really complex human experience in which these anxieties don't actually invalidate the other. They all coexist together, and this is actually crazy. And lastly, I'm narrowing attention. By saying what we won't do, that we won't solve the trajectory of that lived experience, and narrowing attention to doing it better tomorrow, I'm creating a cognitively manageable task. Training for all of diversity and inclusion is uncomfortable because diversity and inclusion is uncomfortable. And you already know that because you avoid many conversations with your colleagues. But we need you in that conversation. And it is likely the person in the room, your colleague, whose cortisol and adrenaline is pumping the most, whose threat response is most triggered, who we most need to be listening and changing their behavior. We need to create environments of productive discomfort where we're managing threat, and we can do that through training, design, and facilitation. We can do that in our trainings on bias in the interview process, and we can do it in our trainings on inclusive communication and culture. In inclusive communication and culture, we can create environments where people can have difficult conversations about the fact that there are folks in the room who sometimes dominate the conversation in meetings and on Slack. In our trainings on bias in the interview process, we can have conversations with interviewers and hiring managers about interviewing and selecting candidates from underrepresented groups when leadership and the engineering department look almost entirely white and Asian. These are critical conversations, and they are also difficult conversations, and that makes managing threat essential. We must be able to create this environment of productive discomfort in order to enable productive learning and effectively make organizations diverse, equitable, and inclusive. Thank you.